She was the kind of girl whose presence felt like a soft breeze on a hot afternoon, unnoticed by many but impossible to deny once it touched you. Gentle in nature, quiet in spirit, she carried herself with a humility that made even her smallest gestures shine. From the time she was little, she had been known for her kindness. If an elder dropped something, she was the first to bend down and pick it up. If a child cried from hunger, she would sneak them part of her own meal, even if it meant she herself would go without. Her late mother had raised her to believe that no matter how harsh the world became, goodness was never wasted, and that one's heart should remain untarnished even in storms. These lessons stayed with her long after her mother's death, like seeds planted deep in soil that no cruelty could uproot. Her life, however, was no gentle tale. After her mother's passing, her father remarried, and soon the weight of misfortune began to press upon her shoulders. Her stepmother arrived with sharp eyes and a voice that dripped with sweetness only when she spoke to others, never to the girl. To her there were only insults and commands. She saw the girl not as a child deserving of love, but as a nuisance, a shadow that reminded her husband of a woman she could never replace. And when her own daughter was born, her bitterness doubled, for she could not tolerate the fact that this quiet stepchild seemed to outshine her own child in beauty, grace, and gentle nature. From dawn until night, the girl was burdened with endless chores. She rose before the sun to fetch water from the well, her bare feet scraping against stones, her thin frame balancing pots heavier than she should have been able to carry. She swept the yard, washed clothes in cold water until her fingers were raw, and pounded grain until her arms ached. All the while, her stepsister lounged in shade, her hands soft, her laughter mocking. "Look at her," the stepsister would say with a sneer, "she was born to serve." The stepmother, instead of silencing such cruelty, encouraged it with approving nods or venomous smiles. Yet, in the face of such treatment, the girl never raised her voice. She endured the insults as though they were passing winds. When they mocked her, she bowed her head. When they struck her with words meant to wound, she held her silence, her lips curving into the faintest smile, as if refusing to surrender the light within her. She was no fool, she knew the world was against her, but she also knew that hatred spread only when it was answered with hatred. To her, carrying kindness was not weakness but strength, the kind her late mother had whispered about when she was still alive. At night, when the sky turned dark and the stars stretched wide, she would slip away to the quiet of the open fields or sit beneath the ancient tree by the riverbank. There, away from sharp tongues and watchful eyes, she could breathe freely. Sometimes she spoke aloud, though no one was near to listen. Prayers for strength, soft songs her mother once sang, or words of comfort to herself. Even in solitude, she was not bitter. She spoke as though she still carried love within her, as though she refused to let cruelty make her cold. Villagers often noticed her but rarely helped. They whispered about her beauty, about how she carried her late mother's grace, but they were too afraid of her stepmother to intervene. The stepmother had a strong tongue and sharper alliances. No one wished to make her their enemy. Some pitied the girl, but pity was all they offered. Others shrugged, believing it was fate, one of those harsh tales life spun where the gentle were tested by endless fire. But what no one could take from her was her innocence, that quiet purity that clung to her like a fragrance. Even when she returned from the well covered in dust, even when her hands were red and blistered from work, even when her dress was torn from constant use, she seemed touched by a light that did not fade. Her eyes, soft and searching, held no resentment. Her smile, though faint, carried warmth even for those who mocked her. She seemed to hold a secret strength, a belief that the heart could stay clean no matter how much dirt the world threw upon it. It was this purity that made her stepmother despise her even more. For every insult meant to crush her spirit, the girl's kindness was like a mirror that reflected the cruelty back, though she never intended it. Her goodness became unbearable for those who wished to see her broken, because it proved she was stronger than their hatred. In the girl's quiet endurance lay a truth too heavy for them to face, that a soul untainted by bitterness could not truly be conquered. And so her days passed in hardship, her nights in stolen moments of peace. She had little in her hands but much in her heart. Where others saw weakness, the spirits, if they were watching, surely saw strength. Where her stepmother saw a curse, perhaps the ancestors saw a blessing waiting to unfold. For in her innocence, in her unwavering gentleness, there was something unearthly, something that no cruelty could destroy, and something that one day would turn the shame intended for her back upon those who had tried to strip her of her dignity. This was the girl, gentle, humble, pure of heart. Mistreated daily, yet she never lost her kindness, never allowed her light to dim. And though she did not know it yet, her innocence was not weakness but a shield, one that would soon call upon forces greater than hatred, greater even than the cruelty of her stepmother and stepsister. Her stepmother's cruelty did not grow overnight, it was a slow poison, fed by envy and hardened by bitterness. At first, when she married into the household, she hid her true nature behind honeyed smiles and soft words. She pretended to care for the girl, offering small gestures of false kindness in front of the villagers, but even then, her eyes betrayed something sharp and watchful. She noticed how, despite being clothed in rags and burdened with endless chores, the girl carried herself with a dignity that her own daughter could never mimic. The girl's quiet beauty was not just in her face but in the way she moved, the way her kindness softened even the hardest moments. It was this unshakable grace that stung the stepmother most, for it made her own daughter's arrogance and harshness look uglier by comparison. The more she watched, the more envy bloomed like a dark weed in her chest. Her daughter had soft hands, pampered skin, and fine clothes, yet when people looked at her, their eyes did not linger in admiration the way they did on the girl. Even whispers in the village compared them. "How is it," some said quietly, "that the stepdaughter shines brighter than the favored child?" Those whispers reached the stepmother's ears like daggers, cutting her pride into pieces. She could not stand it. She would not allow her daughter to be overshadowed by a girl she considered a servant in her own house. And so the stepmother began planting seeds of malice among the villagers. She spoke with a voice of concern, feigning sadness as she told stories that twisted the girl's goodness into something sinister. "She spends too much time alone," the stepmother would say, shaking her head. "She whispers to the wind and stares at the stars as though they answer her. Is that the behavior of a normal child?" When some villagers defended the girl, saying she was simply gentle and shy, the stepmother pressed harder. Gentle? Or cursed? Beauty that does not fade even with hunger, strength that does not weaken even with endless chores. Tell me, is that natural? Or is it something darker? Little by little, suspicion grew. People who once pitied the girl now avoided her gaze, whispering behind her back. Children who used to play nearby began throwing stones, chanting cruel names, repeating the stepmother's poison without even understanding it. The stepmother, satisfied, fanned the flames further. Each time the girl's kindness shone through, she twisted it into another reason to despise her. "She acts too good for us," she sneered to anyone who would listen. "She smiles when insulted, as though she carries a secret above us all. Pride is hidden in her silence, you cannot see it?" The girl herself remained unaware of how deep the lies had spread. She continued with her chores, with her quiet resilience, believing that patience would keep the peace. But behind closed doors, the stepmother sharpened her cruelty like a blade. She gave the girl the heaviest tasks, sending her out into the scorching sun while her daughter sat in shade. She withheld food, letting her go to bed hungry, then told the villagers the girl refused meals because she was fasting for strange spirits. Every act of endurance became, in the villagers' minds, evidence of something unnatural. Her stepsister, encouraged by her mother, followed suit. She mocked the girl openly, pulling at her tattered clothes and laughing at her blistered hands. "Look at her," she said loud enough for others to hear. "No matter how dirty she becomes, she does not complain. Perhaps she is not human at all." The villagers, who once might have scolded a child for such cruelty, instead nodded uneasily, for by now they believed the stepmother's words, that the girl was cursed, that she was marked by forces beyond understanding. The stepmother's jealousy turned into a mission. It was not enough to overwork the girl, not enough to humiliate her in private. She wanted the whole village to see her stepdaughter as a stain, a danger, someone unworthy of kindness. In her mind, the only way to preserve her own daughter's honor was to break the girl completely, to strip her of every shred of dignity. If the villagers believed the girl cursed, then every misfortune in the village could be blamed on her. A poor harvest? The cursed child's presence. A sudden illness? Surely her spirit carried it. In this way the stepmother ensured that hatred spread like wildfire. The girl, however, never cursed them back, never raised her voice in protest. She accepted the insults with bowed head and steady heart. This, more than anything, enraged the stepmother further. For in her silence lay a strength that mocked every attempt to tear her down. She could not stand that her cruelty only seemed to make the girl shine brighter. She could not bear that, no matter how much dirt she threw, the girl's innocence refused to be buried. And so the roots of cruelty grew deep, entwining the stepmother's envy, the stepsister's arrogance, and the villagers' fear. They convinced themselves that breaking the girl was not only justified but necessary. They told one another that to let her live unchallenged was to invite disaster. And all the while, the girl continued to live among them, humble, graceful, carrying a light none of them could extinguish, though they would soon try with all the malice their hearts could muster. When the stepmother's jealousy reached its darkest point, she realized that words, whispers, and petty chores could no longer satisfy the hunger in her heart. She had managed to convince the villagers that the girl was cursed, but still there were moments when her beauty, her quiet grace, and her untouchable dignity made others hesitate. Some, even in their fear, could not deny that the girl carried something extraordinary within her. That silent glow infuriated the stepmother more than anything else, for no amount of lies could erase it. She wanted to crush it completely, to drag the girl down so far that no one would ever look at her with admiration again. Her twisted mind searched for a way to break the girl's spirit once and for all. She needed something public, something so cruel that even the girl's strength of heart could not withstand it. And then the idea came to her, an idea so wicked it made her lips curl into a smile. If the girl's beauty and dignity were what people admired, then those were the very things she would destroy. At the next village gathering, she would humiliate her so completely that the girl would be remembered not for her grace but for her shame. The occasion presented itself easily enough. The villagers often gathered at the center of the village for festivals, announcements, and communal judgments. One such gathering was called when a neighboring clan came to trade goods and celebrate a harvest. The square filled with people, drums echoed, fires were lit, and the stepmother saw her moment. With eyes gleaming, she stepped into the circle and raised her voice so all could hear. "My people," she said, her tone dripping with feigned sorrow, "we have sheltered a curse among us far too long. My stepdaughter, with her strange silence and unnatural endurance, is no blessing. She defies us with her proud beauty, making us look like fools. Tell me, is this not a spirit hiding in a girl's form?" The villagers, already poisoned by her lies, murmured in agreement. Some shook their heads, others whispered nervously, but the seed of suspicion had long since taken root. The stepmother's voice grew louder, more confident. "We must test her, strip her of her false dignity. If she is truly human, she will endure. If she is not, then the ancestors will show us. Let her walk the village bare before all eyes. Let her pride be broken so that her curse may be revealed." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even among the cruel, there was shock at the suggestion. To strip someone of their clothes and dignity was the harshest punishment, reserved for those who had committed unforgivable crimes. It was meant to erase their honor forever. Yet here was the stepmother, demanding it for a girl whose only fault was being too quiet, too graceful, too enduring. The stepsister, standing at her mother's side, burst into laughter. She clapped her hands and cried, "Yes, let her walk as nothing. Then we shall see if the spirits still favor her." Her voice was shrill with delight, feeding off the cruelty like a vulture circling a dying prey. The girl, standing among them, heard every word. Her face grew pale, but she did not cry out. Her hands trembled, yet she kept her head lowered. In her chest, her heart pounded like a drum, not from shame but from the sheer weight of injustice pressing upon her. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Still, the thought of walking naked before all the villagers, people who had once played with her, who now called her cursed, was a pain deeper than any wound she had endured before. The villagers began to argue. Some, consumed by superstition, agreed with the stepmother. "Yes," they muttered, "let her be tested. If she is pure, the ancestors will protect her. If she is cursed, she will be exposed." Others hesitated, unease flickering in their eyes. "She is just a girl," a few whispered. "Is this not too much?" But the stepmother silenced them with venom. "Too much?" she spat. "What is too much for a curse? If we let her be, she will poison our children, our crops, our future. Better to shame one than doom us all." And with those words, the crowd's hesitation broke. Their fear outweighed their pity, and their cruelty outweighed their conscience. One by one, their voices rose in agreement until the drums were drowned by chants. "Make her walk! Make her walk!" The girl stood frozen in the center, the sound pounding in her ears like thunder. She felt their eyes already stripping her bare, tearing at her dignity before they had even laid a hand on her. Her stepsister grinned wide, and her stepmother's face gleamed with triumph. They believed they had won, that they had finally found a punishment that would destroy her spirit completely. But what they did not know, what none of them could have foreseen, was that humiliation planned by cruelty often awakens a power greater than cruelty itself. And as the girl braced herself for the worst, the winds above the village began to stir, as though the heavens themselves had heard the wicked plan and were preparing their own answer. The day of the gathering was meant to be one of unity for the village, but instead it became a stage for cruelty. The stepmother, her heart heavy with malice, whispered into eager ears until the idea of humiliating the girl became the crowd's entertainment. When the moment came, they dragged her from her small hut where she had been sweeping, her broom still resting in the corner. She had not been prepared, she had no warning, no chance to shield herself. Rough hands tore at her clothing until what little protection she had was stripped away. The cloth, worn but decent, fell in tatters at her feet, leaving her trembling, exposed to the midday sun. She tried to cover herself with her arms, but the villagers yanked them away, forcing her forward. The path through the village stretched long and merciless. Dust swirled beneath her bare feet as the people gathered, forming a corridor of mockery. Her stepmother walked proudly behind her, ensuring she did not stop, her voice sharp as she urged the crowd to laugh, to scorn, to remind everyone that this girl was less than human. Each word was a dagger, and yet the girl's lips remained sealed. She would not beg for mercy, she would not plead with those who delighted in her suffering. Children, too young to understand cruelty but quick to mimic it, pointed their fingers and laughed, chanting names given by their parents. Women threw handfuls of dust into her hair, the fine earth clinging to her skin like a second skin of disgrace. Men stood with folded arms, their laughter deep and harsh, some spitting on the ground before her so she would be forced to walk over their contempt. Every sound, every insult, every gust of wind seemed designed to break her spirit. Yet she lifted her chin, even as her eyes burned with unspilled tears. Her steps were slow but steady. Each pace forward was an act of defiance, though it appeared meek to the mocking crowd. She told herself silently that she was more than the body they exposed, more than the shame they wished to pour over her. Dignity, she whispered within, was not something that could be taken by force. Her skin could be revealed, her name dragged through the dust, but her soul remained her own, untouched. As she moved further along, some in the crowd grew crueler. A group of boys gathered stones, not to injure, but to toss at her feet, laughing as she stumbled. A woman shouted that even the dogs should turn their heads away from her filth. Another suggested she be covered in ashes, to remind everyone of her supposed curse. Each suggestion was met with roars of approval, as though the cruelty of one fed the appetite of the rest. Yet in that sea of jeering voices, a few fell silent. An old man shook his head quietly, though he dared not speak. A young girl clung to her mother's skirt, her wide eyes filled with confusion at the sight of kindness punished. These small fragments of humanity flickered like hidden stars behind a darkened sky, unseen by most but present nonetheless. The march seemed endless. Her feet ached, scraped by stones coated in dust. The sun blazed above, merciless in its heat, making her shame burn hotter upon her skin. Still she did not cry. Her silence unnerved some, though they laughed louder to cover their discomfort. They expected her to break, to scream, to cover her face and collapse in defeat. Instead, she walked on, her silence a shield stronger than their words. Each moment that passed without her breaking made her seem less like a victim and more like a figure carved from patience and endurance. By the time she reached the heart of the village, her body was weary, her spirit battered by ridicule, yet she stood tall. Dust clung to every part of her, but there was a strange radiance in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that even the cruelest villager could not fully ignore. They saw a girl shamed, but some began to sense they were also seeing something far greater, a spirit unyielding, a soul unbroken, a dignity that no hand, no laugh, no insult could strip away. In that silence, while the crowd roared, something unseen stirred. The wind shifted, light began to gather, and though she did not yet know it, her humiliation was about to transform into something far beyond what her tormentors had planned. Her steps carried her forward, but her body trembled with every pace. The dust clinging to her skin burned as though each grain was a reminder of the scorn that surrounded her. She felt the weight of every eye, the sting of every cruel laugh, the mocking rhythm of footsteps following behind. Yet within her there was another weight, heavier but sacred. It was the burden of her own heart, filled with a pain so vast it threatened to crush her spirit, yet she held it gently, refusing to let bitterness take root. She told herself that her suffering could not be allowed to twist her into the likeness of those who mocked her. Her stepmother wished her to break, to curse, to strike back in anger and reveal herself as something unworthy. But she knew her strength was not in striking back, nor in falling silent with hatred, but in keeping her heart untainted. Her lips barely moved, but in her heart she prayed. She prayed not loudly, not with words the crowd could hear, but in the hushed silence of her spirit. She prayed to the ancestors who walked the unseen paths between earth and sky. She prayed to the spirits of the river, the wind, and the trees that still remembered kindness. She asked them not for vengeance, for she knew vengeance was a flame that destroyed both the one who lit it and the one it sought. Instead, she asked only for protection, not of her body which had already been exposed, beaten and shamed, but of her soul. "Do not let their cruelty stain me," she whispered inwardly. "Do not let their hatred make me bitter. Guard my heart, for if it breaks in anger then they will have won." Tears pressed at the corners of her eyes, but she did not let them fall, for she knew the crowd would see them as triumph. They would laugh harder, clap their hands and shout that even her tears were proof of weakness. So she kept them buried within, each one a secret offering to the heavens. Each tear unspilled was like a pearl placed at the feet of the ancestors, a quiet testimony of her endurance. Though her body was naked, her soul clothed itself in prayer, wrapping itself in invisible garments stronger than any cloth. The crowd's laughter grew louder, but in her ears it became distant, muffled, as though the prayers inside her were forming a barrier against the noise. She could still hear it, but it no longer pierced her with the same cruelty. Instead, she thought of her mother, long gone, who had once held her close and told her stories under the light of the moon. She remembered how her mother had said, "A pure heart is a light that no shadow can extinguish." Those words returned to her now, glowing softly in her memory, like embers refusing to die. She clung to them, repeating them with every step. "No shadow can extinguish me," she whispered inside herself. "Not even this." Her stepmother's voice rang sharp behind her, mocking, cruel, urging the people to see the girl as cursed. But the girl did not let that voice nestle in her heart. She refused to let her stepmother's words define her. "I am not cursed," she told herself. "I am not what she says I am. I am what the spirits see in me." It was not easy. Every word of hatred pressed against her like thorns, but her prayer was the water that cooled the wounds before they could fester. She imagined the spirits standing in unseen circles around her, holding back the sharpest stones, carrying her trembling feet when her legs threatened to give way. The path grew longer, and with each step she felt her body weaken. Her knees trembled, her arms ached from trying to shield herself before they were pulled away again, her back bent under the invisible weight of shame. But her soul straightened, rising higher even as her body bent lower. She began to feel something she could not explain, a strength not her own, as though the ancestors themselves had placed their hands upon her shoulders and whispered, "Do not fall. We are with you." Though her pain was sharp, she found a strange stillness in it. It was as if suffering itself had turned into prayer. The ache in her chest became her cry to the heavens, the trembling of her body became her offering, the silence of her lips became her song. She realized that no punishment, no humiliation, no cruelty could truly strip her of dignity unless she gave it away. And she would not. Not even now. The villagers mocked, but she began to see their cruelty for what it was, not power but weakness disguised as strength. Why else would they need to strip her bare, unless they feared the quiet strength she carried? Why else would they laugh so loudly, unless they needed to drown out the whisper of their own guilt? These thoughts did not fill her with pride but with sorrow. She pitied them, for they were blind. They thought they were exposing her, but in truth they were exposing themselves. They showed the ancestors their cruelty, their envy, their hunger for shame. And one day she knew the spirits would remember. Her heart ached with such intensity that she nearly stumbled, but again she prayed. "Spirits, give me the strength to finish this walk. Let me carry my pain without letting it turn me bitter. Let me endure until the end, so that when this moment is remembered, it will not be of my defeat but of my grace." The wind stirred gently, brushing against her skin as though answering her prayer. It was not strong, not yet, but it carried with it a strange comfort, cooling her burning cheeks, brushing away the dust from her face. She felt for the first time that she was not alone. She closed her eyes for a moment, walking blind but steady, trusting the wind as though it were guiding her steps. She thought of it as a hand, invisible yet tender, covering her shame, whispering promises of protection. The pain in her heart was still heavy, but within that pain grew a flame, not of anger but of faith. She began to believe that her humiliation would not be the end of her story. Something larger was stirring, something greater than the cruelty of the crowd. She did not know what it was, but she felt it like a promise carved into the sky. And so she kept walking, trembling but unbroken, humiliated but not conquered, praying silently with every breath that her soul would remain as clear and untainted as the morning light. Her prayer grew longer with every step, spilling into the silence of her heart like water into a dry riverbed. She prayed for herself, yes, but also for the children who had mocked her without understanding, for the women whose laughter was born of envy, for the men whose strength was wasted on cruelty. She prayed for them because she knew that cruelty bound them in chains as heavy as her shame. Let them see, she whispered to the ancestors, let them one day understand. Do not let their hearts remain hard forever. Soften them even if not today. The girl's pain was still immense, but in that moment her prayer transformed it. Her trembling was no longer only weakness, but a rhythm of endurance. Her tears remained hidden, but they no longer burned, they cooled her spirit like quiet rain. Her humiliation remained, but it no longer consumed her. She began to understand that dignity was not in the eyes of others but in the keeping of her soul. And her soul was safe, wrapped in the prayers she whispered, wrapped in the unseen arms of the ancestors who had not abandoned her. At first, it was only a whisper against her skin, so faint that she thought it might have been her imagination. A soft stirring brushed against her shoulder, cooling the dust that clung to her bare skin. The air seemed to shift, not like the ordinary winds of the evening, which often came and went without care, but something deliberate, something alive. She raised her head ever so slightly, her eyes still downcast in shame but her spirit sensing that something had changed. Her stepmother's laughter echoed sharply in her ears, but the sound did not sting as deeply as before. For in its place another presence had entered, the wind. It began as a tender breeze, circling her body as though it wished to shield her from the cruel stares. It carried with it a coolness that soothed her trembling, a gentle rhythm that matched her faltering steps. The villagers did not notice at first, too consumed with their jeering and their cruel delight. They threw dust at her feet and clapped their hands, demanding that she lower her head further in shame. But as the girl walked, the breeze continued to follow her, curling around her arms, brushing against her legs, lifting strands of her hair so that they shimmered faintly in the dying light of the sun. She felt at first as comfort, like invisible hands reaching to cover her, wrapping her in a cloak not of fabric but of air. She thought of her prayers, whispered moments before, and wondered if this was the answer. Could it be that the ancestors had heard her? Could it be that the spirits of the world, those who moved unseen, who dwelled in the sky and in the rustling of leaves, had chosen to walk beside her in this moment? She closed her eyes briefly, her lips trembling as she whispered in her heart, "If it is you, protect me. Cover me. Do not let their cruelty strip me of who I am." The wind grew stronger, no longer a faint whisper but a steady presence, as though it had purpose. It seemed to dance with her, swirling about her body in patterns that no ordinary breeze would follow. The dust thrown at her did not cling to her skin but was lifted and carried away. The cruel laughter of the villagers began to waver, for some noticed that the dust they hurled returned to sting their own faces, tossed back by the strange air that circled her. Children who had jeered grew silent, clutching their mother's skirts as they watched with wide eyes. The stepsister frowned, unease tightening her face, and the stepmother hissed louder, trying to command the crowd's attention, trying to make them laugh again. But laughter was harder now, for something strange was happening, and all could feel it, even if they dared not name it. The breeze had become a companion, circling the girl, following her every step. It lifted her hair until it shimmered like threads of gold in the fading sunlight, it brushed across her skin so that the shame of her nakedness seemed to blur, cloaking her in shifting patterns of air. To some, it looked as though she wore a robe of light spun by the very heavens. To others, it was as if the ancestors themselves had breathed life into the air to guard her dignity. The girl, though still trembling, began to feel a deep calm spread through her chest. The heaviness of her heart did not disappear, but it was no longer crushing. She felt lifted, carried, as though each step forward was guided not by her own failing strength but by something greater, something unseen. She did not speak, for words seemed too small for what she felt. She only closed her eyes again and allowed the wind to wrap her, to hold her, to be the answer she had begged for. The villagers could no longer pretend not to see. Murmurs rose among them, whispers sharp as arrows but trembling with fear. "Do you see it? The air, it moves with her." "No, it is only the night wind," another insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it not touch us?" "Why only her?" came the reply. And with those words the laughter faltered even more. Where there had been mockery there was now unease. Where there had been certainty of her shame, there was now doubt. The stepmother tried to shout above the whispers, her voice harsh and desperate. "It is a trick. Do not be fooled. She is cursed, she brings spirits with her to deceive us." But even as she spoke, the breeze lifted again, circling her stepdaughter like a living veil, and the villagers saw that there was no trick. No human hand guided this wind. No spell cast by the girl moved the air. It was the sky itself that had come to her defense. The girl's steps grew steadier. She lifted her head a little higher, though not in pride, only in quiet strength. She still prayed within herself, but now her prayers were filled not only with pleas but with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered silently to the ancestors, "for hearing me. Thank you for answering when I thought I was alone." The wind brushed her cheeks as though in reply, a soft kiss of reassurance, and for the first time since her humiliation began, her heart felt light. As she moved forward, the breeze grew into a stronger current. It stirred the dust of the earth, lifting it into small spirals that glimmered faintly in the dimming light. It carried with it the faint scent of flowers from distant fields, a fragrance so out of place in the midst of cruelty that some gasped aloud. Others shielded their eyes as the air swirled more boldly, not wild, not destructive, but purposeful, wrapping the girl in circles of light and motion. To the onlookers, she appeared no longer naked but adorned, clothed in a garment that no hand could tear, no cruelty could strip away. Her stepmother grew furious, her face twisting as she shouted again. But her words were drowned by the rushing sound of the air, which had grown too strong to ignore. The stepsister, trembling, clung to her mother's arm, whispering, "It is not natural, mother. Look at her, she is not cursed, she is chosen." The stepmother struck her, silencing her with fear, but the villagers had heard enough. Doubt was no longer doubt, it was belief forming quietly in their hearts. The girl walked on, her trembling body still marked by pain, but her spirit rising with every step. The breeze no longer felt merely like wind, it felt alive, aware, protective. It moved when she moved, it shielded when she faltered, it wrapped her when her shame threatened to overtake her. And in that moment she understood that her prayers had not been lost to the air, they had become the air. Her pain had risen like smoke to the sky, and the sky had answered by returning to her as protection. The villagers watched in silence now, their jeers stolen by awe. Where moments before there had been only mockery and cruelty, there was now a stillness heavy with reverence. They could not deny what their eyes beheld. A girl, stripped of dignity by human hands, was being clothed by the heavens themselves. Her humiliation was transforming before their very eyes into something holy, something untouchable. And the girl, though she did not yet know what the wind would do next, understood one truth deeply in her heart: she was not alone. She never had been. And with every breath of wind that wrapped her body, her faith grew stronger, her spirit brighter, until her shame no longer burned, it glowed. The wind that had begun as a whisper did not stop at circling her. It grew stronger, not in violence but in intention, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. Dust lifted from the earth in small, shimmering whirls, carried upward until it caught the last beams of the sinking sun. The glow turned ordinary dust into threads of gold, strands of light that swirled around her trembling body. Where once the villagers had forced her to walk naked in shame, the world itself now rose to clothe her, weaving something greater than fabric. At first she did not notice. Her eyes were lowered, focused only on the path before her thoughts caught between prayers and the heavy thudding of her heart. But then she felt warmth settle on her skin, not the harsh burn of humiliation, not the heat of dust and stares, but a tender warmth, soft and radiant. She lifted her head slightly, and the gasp of the crowd reached her ears before her own eyes understood what was happening. Golden light circled her waist, curling like a ribbon, climbing upward to her shoulders. Her hair, tangled and dusty, shimmered as strands of brightness threaded through it, so that it appeared as though woven with sunlight. The more the wind moved, the more the glow expanded, until what had been bare flesh was no longer exposed but hidden beneath a garment no hand could tear. It was not cloth, nor silk, nor beads. It was light itself, born of dust, air and sun, fused into a covering more glorious than anything made by human craft. The villagers stood frozen, their voices choked in their throats. Moments before, their laughter had filled the air, sharp and cruel, but now silence pressed over them like a heavy blanket. They had wished for her shame, yet the world had turned their cruelty into her glory. Their eyes, which had burned with judgment, now burned with awe, for before them stood not a broken, naked girl but a figure bathed in golden radiance, as though she were kin to the sun itself. The stepmother's face twisted in rage. She screamed for the villagers to look away, to stop being deceived, but her voice cracked and faltered, for even she could not deny what her eyes beheld. Her stepsister clung to her arm, trembling, whispering frantically that this was no trick, that it was real. But the stepmother slapped her aside, her fury louder than her fear, though her own legs shook beneath her. The girl, wrapped in light, began to feel the weight of her shame lifting. Each step she took seemed lighter than the last, her trembling replaced by a steady grace she had never known. For so long she had endured cruelty and insult in silence, carrying burdens that should never have been hers. Now for the first time she felt as though the world itself acknowledged her suffering, and in return, it clothed her in a dignity no human hand could strip away. She touched her chest lightly, feeling nothing but the warmth of the glow, and her eyes filled with tears, not tears of pain but tears of awe. Was this truly for her? Was this the answer to her prayers, the gift of the spirits she had begged for in her silence? She whispered within her heart, "You have not forgotten me. You have heard me. You have lifted me when they sought to bury me." The villagers could not tear their eyes away. Some fell to their knees, unable to stand before the radiance that surrounded her. Children hid behind their parents, peeking out in wonder, no longer laughing but wide-eyed, as if they were gazing at a spirit come to life. Elders muttered prayers, their voices trembling, unsure whether to call her blessed or divine. The younger men and women, who had jeered the loudest, now covered their faces in shame, for the very light that covered her revealed their own darkness. The wind did not still. It gathered more dust, more fragments of sunlight, weaving them tighter, brighter, until her entire form glowed. Her arms were covered in flowing streaks of gold that fluttered like sleeves. Around her legs, the light swirled like a flowing skirt, trailing behind her as she walked. Her bare feet glimmered as though she walked not upon earth but upon light itself. And around her face, a crown seemed to shimmer, not crafted by hands but born of the sky, a halo of wind and sun that marked her as untouchable. She no longer felt naked, no longer broken. Instead, she felt whole, as though the light were not just covering her body but clothing her soul, restoring all the dignity stolen by cruelty. Her every breath felt lighter, her every movement graceful, her every step powerful yet gentle. She did not shout, she did not curse, she did not seek revenge. She simply walked, clothed in silence and radiance, and that silence spoke louder than any voice could. The stepmother's fury turned into fear. She stumbled back, her shouts losing strength, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Her plan, crafted so carefully meant to destroy the girl's dignity, had instead raised her higher than anyone in the village. The stepsister wept openly, covering her face, unable to bear the sight of the sister she had mocked now walking like a figure from a dream. And the villagers, who had been so quick to mock, now felt the weight of shame press heavy on their hearts. For they realized what they had done. They had tried to strip dignity from one who had done no wrong, and the heavens themselves had answered in her defense. The girl walked until she reached the center of the village, the wind still circling, the light still glowing. She paused, lifting her eyes to the sky, and in that moment the glow seemed to intensify, as though the heavens themselves bowed to her spirit. The silence was unbroken, except for the soft rushing of the wind and the beating of countless hearts. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her very presence, radiant and calm, was a message none could ignore. Cruelty cannot strip away what the heavens choose to honor. Nakedness could not shame her when the world itself clothed her in light. Weakness could not destroy her when the spirits chose to strengthen her. And silence, her silence, was louder than all their laughter combined. The villagers lowered their heads, some weeping, some praying, some trembling with fear. They had mocked her, but now they saw her as something sacred, untouchable. Even those who had hated her most dared not meet her eyes. The girl, though wrapped in radiance, did not grow proud. She carried herself humbly as she always had, her heart still gentle, her spirit still kind. She did not look upon them with anger, but with quiet sadness, as though she pitied their blindness. She knew the light was not hers to command, it was a gift, a mercy, a shield sent by powers greater than herself. And so she bore it with humility as she bore all things. The wind finally eased, though the glow did not fade entirely. Instead, it lingered around her like a second skin, a constant reminder of what had happened. The villagers watched as she walked, their silence following her like a shadow. They had wished to destroy her dignity, but instead, they had given rise to a legend. For from that day on, no one would forget the sight of the girl clothed in light. Her humiliation had become her honor. Her shame had become her glory. And the cruel hands that had torn her clothes had only made space for the heavens to dress her in radiance. The laughter that once shook the air faded into a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the entire village. Dust still hung in the air from the mocking hands that had moments before been flung at her, but now no one dared move. Where once the people had jeered and clapped their hands in cruel rhythm, their mouths fell open, stunned into disbelief. The girl who had been forced to walk in shame was no longer bare before them. She was robed in a garment not stitched by human hands, but woven by the very breath of the wind and kissed by sunlight. The glowing fabric shimmered with each movement she made, flowing like water yet holding the strength of fire. The villagers' eyes widened. Some rubbed their faces, thinking dust had clouded their vision. Others fell back a step, clutching their throats, unable to speak. Children who had laughed now gripped their mothers' skirts, trembling at the sight. The elders, usually slow to move, straightened as though struck by lightning. They exchanged wary glances, their voices caught in their throats because they knew no ordinary girl could have summoned such a thing. The stepmother and stepsister, who had watched proudly as she was dragged through the dirt, now stood rooted in place. Their smirks collapsed into stiff masks of fear. The stepsister tugged at her mother's arm, whispering frantically, "Mother, how is this happening?" But the stepmother had no answer. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted from the girl to the villagers, searching for some explanation, yet none came. Even the wind seemed to hush, leaving only a low hum that carried reverence, as though the earth itself demanded silence in witness of what had unfolded. The girl's face was calm, her eyes lowered, her steps unshaken. It was as if she had already known the spirits would not abandon her, as if she trusted in something greater while everyone else trusted in cruelty. That calmness unnerved the crowd even more than the radiance itself. A man who had thrown a stone earlier dropped it now, ashamed, the sound of it hitting the ground echoing like thunder in the quiet. One by one the villagers realized what they had done. Their hands, which had been eager to mock, now felt heavy with guilt. Some tried to cover their faces, others bowed their heads, but all could feel the weight of judgment pressing on their shoulders, not from the girl but from the miracle that wrapped her in light. The silence deepened until the only sound was her steady footsteps on the dirt road. It was no longer the march of shame, it was a procession of grace. Her glowing garment caught the dawn's rays, casting golden light across the faces of the crowd, and no one could look at her without feeling both awe and sorrow. Awe because they knew she had been touched by powers beyond them. Sorrow because they had been the instruments of cruelty that brought her to this moment. By the time she reached the center of the village, no one dared laugh or whisper. The girl had been mocked as weak, cursed, and unworthy. But now, in the silence that weighed heavier than thunder, all saw the truth. She was not the broken one, they were. The miracle had turned their cruelty into their shame, and their silence became the loudest confession of all. The crowd's silence began to shift into murmurs, whispers rolling like an invisible tide through the gathered villagers. One by one, heads turned, not toward the girl clothed in light, but toward the two women standing frozen in the shadow of their own deeds, the stepmother and her daughter. The very ones who had plotted this humiliation, who had laughed the loudest when the girl was dragged into the dust, now stood trembling. Their faces drained of color, their hands fidgeting nervously, and the proud tilt of their heads faltered beneath the weight of the villagers' gaze. "Did you see?" A voice whispered harshly from the back. "It was they who ordered her to walk this way." "Yes," another replied. "I saw her stepmother laugh while the girl's clothes were torn. I saw her clap her hands as though this was sport." The whispers grew louder, sharper, each word cutting into the trembling figures of the stepmother and her daughter. People who once joined in the mockery now began to distance themselves, shifting their feet and pulling their children closer, as though standing near the cruel women would taint them too. The girl's radiance had drawn out not only awe but truth, and the truth was clear. The stepmother and stepsister's cruelty had been laid bare. The stepmother's lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her stepsister clung to her arm, whispering frantically, "Mother, they're looking at us, they know, what do we do?" But the older woman could only shake her head in despair. Her once commanding eyes, which had struck fear into the girl so many times, now darted nervously from villager to villager, unable to hold their gaze. Every whisper seemed to echo like thunder in her ears. "She was jealous," one woman said firmly, loud enough for others to hear. "Jealous of the girl's beauty, of her goodness." "She feared her," an elder muttered, his voice trembling with anger. "Feared her light even before the spirits revealed it." The stepsister, who had always sneered at the girl's quiet endurance, now felt her body quake. Her own face, once lifted proudly in scorn, turned red with humiliation. She tried to hide behind her mother's shawl, but it was no use. The villagers' eyes pierced through every veil. She remembered laughing as the girl's clothes were torn, remembered mocking her gentleness in the open streets. Now those memories burned like fire against her skin, hotter than any sun. The girl, glowing in her garment of wind and light, did not even glance at them. She walked with her head bowed, her steps steady, her calmness cutting deeper into her stepmother's pride than any accusation could. For years, the stepmother had told herself the girl was weak, powerless, cursed. But in this moment, with the whole village watching, it was clear who was powerless. "Look at them tremble," a young man scoffed. "So quick to mock when they thought the girl defenseless, but now they cannot even stand straight before her." The stepmother tried to speak at last, raising her hands as though to plead. "It was not I," she stammered, her voice cracking, but the villagers were not fooled. They remembered too clearly her sharp commands, her cold eyes, her cruel words. Even as she attempted excuses, her daughter tugged at her, whispering desperately, "They won't believe you, mother, they saw everything." Fear clawed at the stepmother's heart. She had built her life on control over her household, control over the villagers' opinions, control over her daughter's fate. But now all of it slipped through her fingers like sand. Her authority was gone, stolen by the very girl she had tried to destroy. No words could undo the miracle, no lie could cover the truth. The villagers' whispers swelled into a murmur, then into voices raised with certainty. Some spoke of punishment, others of banishment. The elders, grave and solemn, said nothing yet, but their eyes bore into the stepmother and stepsister with the weight of judgment. The stepsister broke first. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out, "I didn't mean it. I only did what she told me." She pointed at her mother, her fingers shaking, her voice cracking in desperation. But her words only deepened the shame, for it showed that envy had not only lived in her heart but had driven her actions as well. The stepmother slapped her daughter's hand down, snarling in a whisper, "Be silent." Yet her own lips trembled, her own voice faltered. She knew there was no silencing the truth now. All the while, the girl in the center stood calm, her radiance illuminating the scene, her silence speaking louder than any accusation. She did not need to expose them, the miracle had already done that. Their trembling, their excuses, their shame, it was enough. The villagers saw it clearly, cruelty had been unmasked and envy had been dragged into the light. The stepmother and stepsister stood not just before the villagers, but before their own guilt, naked in a way far worse than the punishment they had planned for the girl. Their trembling bodies, their fearful eyes, their broken voices, all of it revealed the truth. They had sought to strip the girl of dignity, but instead, it was they who were stripped bare.